Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. Today we're going to talk about the essential elements of Illustrator. I've opened Adobe Illustrator up and I just kind of want to move around the screen and talk about what we're seeing. If you've played with Photoshop before, the program looks somewhat similar, especially if we look over here on the tools. But I'm going to go through and kind of talk about some of the differences and the ways you can take advantage of Illustrator versus Photoshop, or the way that they work together. So the first two things you're going to notice over here on the left, if you can see my cursor moving around the screen, we have a black arrow and an arrow that's underneath that. What we're looking at here is the direct selection tool versus the selection tool. The Photoshop just has a selection tool, and that's going to be like our all-purpose move tool. If we have objects we want to move around the screen and select things to delete or resize, so that's going to be the case for that. A little bit later we're going to be talking about the direct selection tool, which is slightly different, which lets you go in and manipulate shapes in like specific ways, but we're going to hold off on that. But for the beginning, I think just to be aware that the selection tool is going to be your main tool that you use for dragging, resizing, moving things around, and of course selecting. Okay, so a lot of the tools are very similar. If I draw your attention over here to the paintbrush tool, that looks exactly like as if you worked in Photoshop. So if I'm going to do a little doodle on the screen, a couple doodles here, you can see that I'm just dragging the mouse around and I'm making little scribbly lines. One of the things you're going to notice is that when I lift up on the screen, let me go ahead and delete that. When I lift up on the, let's see if I do a little doodle, see how the line is a little bit uneven? Can you see that? Intentionally making it a little squiggly. If I lift up on my brush, watch how it smooths that out a little bit. See that? Okay. Now that wouldn't happen in Photoshop. That's a specifically Illustrator thing, and the reason is that we're now doing working with cleaner, smoother lines than we would have in Photoshop, which is pixel based. So if you guys have used Photoshop, you know that if you zoom in really closely on a line or an image, you see that it's made up of little tiny squares that are called pixels. Okay, see how smooth that line got after I lifted up on my brush? Okay. Now we're dealing with something called vectors, which is a more of a numerical system of keeping things in proportion, and that is not based on like pixels or a bitmap image. And let me give you a little demonstration of the difference between vectors and Photoshop images. So I'm going to go up to my window up here, and I'm going to pull up my navigator. So if any tool is ever missing, by the way, you just go to Window, you scroll down to Navigator, or any thing that's missing from your view screen here. Navigator pops up, and just like in Photoshop, I can zoom in. I'm going to zoom really closely in on that vector line that I drew. Now, as you guys know, in Photoshop, if I do this, I'm going to start to see pixels. I'm now zoomed in 2,400%. I'm going to go in even closer. So there's no end to the quality that you're going to have with Illustrator, which is a huge advantage for a graphic designer, right? So that what that means is I could take a logo that you've designed or anything with text on it, I can blow it up to the size of a billboard, and I'm not going to lose any quality whatsoever. Whereas in Photoshop, you're going to get that blurry, pixely look that we all hate. Illustrator is going to be much sharper and cleaner when it comes to working with logos, text, shapes, and that's what's the preferred program for graphic designers when it comes to that. That's not to say you can't bring images into Illustrator. You most definitely can, but for our purposes, especially starting out, we're going to be doing graphic-based work and not really focusing so much on images. Okay, so we've talked about how that's a vector rather than a pixel. One of the things that you'll notice that's different in Photoshop, every time I draw a line or have a shape or text in Photoshop, it automatically creates a new layer. And that layer would be down here in the lower left-hand corner. We still have layers in Illustrator, but they're not exactly the same in terms of everything being locked in, like the stacked glass sheet formation that we've talked about before. Okay, so that's a huge advantage. What does that mean? It means that I can just take my black arrow, which over here, again, that's my selection tool. I can select these items by themselves. They're not locked into individual layers. They're just free-floating objects. And if I want to get rid of it, in Photoshop, I'd have to throw that layer away, right? Well, no, in Illustrator, I can just select it, hit delete, and it goes away. So select, delete, it goes away, okay? Or if I have a couple objects, I can drag over and select both of them at the same time and then delete those. Okay, so it's really great about grouping things together and letting you have a lot of flexibility when it comes to dealing with objects as individual things rather than locked into layers. Okay, so just like we've talked about before with Photoshop, one thing that is very similar is that if I have my brush tool, I can go over here and my color changes are going to be down here. If you can see my mouse hovering down here on the screen. Right now I have a black line, what's called in Illustrator, that's called a stroke. I can double click that and I can select that and change my color that way. Okay, so the two things we're going to be talking about in Illustrator are the stroke and then the fill. Now that's definitely a new concept. The fill refers to what is inside the object, and the stroke is just the line itself. Okay, so let me give you an example of that. Let's learn about another tool over here. If we go down, or I guess we're actually going up a little bit, we're going to go to the rectangle tool. Any of the tools that have a black triangle in the corner have tools that are underneath them, by the way. So we have the rectangle tool, and under that, if I hold it down, is the ellipse, polygon, star tool, and the line segment tool. Okay, so let's stick with our rectangle tool, something nice and easy. Click, hold down, and drag. Okay, I've got a red line, and that box that I just drew is empty. Okay, so the stroke is set. The stroke is the width of the line, by the way. That's set to 1 point. So I can click that up so we can see it a little bit better. And now I have a red rectangle line. The stroke is red, but the fill is empty. And how do I know it's empty? It's because I've got my little white box with a red line through it. Can you see that down there? Okay, if I want to fill my circle in, I double click the fill, and I can just go through the color picker and pick out whatever color I want. And then, so now, as you can see, the stroke is red and the fill is green. And there's a little boomerang icon that's right beside that. If I click that, it flips them back and forth. Incidentally, you can also select the stroke and have a none click for that. So now I have no stroke, but I have a fill. So the red is still there, but the stroke has now disappeared. Okay, pretty straightforward, I think. Okay, let's talk about like layering in objects a little bit. So let's go ahead and get our, put our stroke back to a, oh, come on, work with me here. All right, keeps defaulting back to this thin line. Anyway, let's draw a couple other little objects here so that we can get some ideas. Let's go to the star tool. So we're going to click, hold down, and drag. I've got a star. We can go in and quickly change the colors here so that we can see them differently. Well, let's draw one more thing. Let's go to the polygon tool. Okay, so we've got a 6-sided object here. Actually, while I'm on this topic, let me go ahead and delete that and show you another little trick. If you select the polygon tool, you can click it, and rather than click, hold down, and drag, if you just click one time, a little window pops up and allows you to pick the number of sides that you want. So the polygon tool can become an octagon tool, and so on and so on. And you can decide how many sides you want that object to have. And the star tool works the same way. If you just click rather than hold down and drag, it'll let you select the number of points that are on the star. Okay, so we can see now we've got 3 objects. Let's make them easily identifiable by changing the color. All right. 3 objects. And again, if we were in Photoshop and you drew 3 objects or had 3, basically brought 3 of anything in, those things would be locked into layers. But now they're free-floating objects. And with my direct selection tool, or I guess I should say my regular selection tool, I can click, hold down, and drag and slide those things around the screen. Okay, easy enough, right? Now, what if I wanted the green object to be in the background and the red object to be in the foreground? Well, what I would need to do is select one of those objects. Let's take the red rectangle. We're going to go up to the top here. We're going to go to Object, Arrange, and we're going to bring to front. And now that rectangle is on top. If we were in Photoshop, you would take your layers and slide those around, remember? But now everything is sort of a free-floating object, and so we're working with objects that are sort of in the middle there. So I'm going to select my red rectangle. I'm going to go to Object, Arrange, and Send Back, and it does the opposite, just pushes it to the background. So pretty simple, but you know, as you can imagine, if you're working on a really complicated project and you've got many, many, many layers, you got to keep up with where they are, and things can actually become hidden too. So you keep that in mind. Where if your red rectangle is obviously in the front and something's behind it, you can forget where the things are. Okay, and again, I can zoom in and out and see where the whole window screen is by doing my navigator here and playing around with that. Okay, objects can go off the edge of the page as well, so I'm going to zoom out so you can see it really well. See how the red rectangle is going off the edge of the page there? Okay, so the thing to keep in mind though is if you saved this as a PDF, if you went and you printed this, that is your crop line right there. So that's where the image would end. So even though the objects can go off the edge, they will not be visible once you save them in your final project. So it's okay to have things kind of go off of your artboard, but be aware that the final project, everything needs to be, you know, within this window box when you go to print or save as a PDF or whatever format that you may be working in. Okay, let's move on and talk about some other things here. I think probably the next best thing to do would be talk about anchor points. And that's where we're going to get into the direct selection tool. So if I look at my star here, I can see that the star actually has, if I move around to my edges, it actually pops up anchor. I know it's very, very small letters there, but if I hover over those edges, it says anchor. See that? Okay, every object that you draw or paint or every text that you work with is made up of anchor points. So we have the stroke, which is the line, but the anchor points are those curves that turn, or those curves that define the shape of the object. Okay, so even a curved object is going to have anchor points as I move around, and those tend to be where the object changes its shape. So see, it's almost like looking at a little roller coaster, and where the crescendo happens, if I hovered over it, I can see the anchor. If I continue to hover, I can see my path, which is like the stroke line, and then I can see those anchor points pop up. Okay, and you're probably thinking, who cares? What does that matter? Well, you can manipulate those anchor points. So that is where the secondary selection tool we're going to talk about, which is called the direct selection tool. That's the white arrow. If I select that and then I hover over the anchor point, I can click, hold down, and drag. And look what's happening. It's bending that shape. It's sort of like manipulating sculptures, the way I think about it. So I can hover over that anchor point, click, hold down, and drag, and really kind of turn it into something else. So you can imagine if you're working on a logo, this is going to be like a really helpful thing to do, because it allows you to, you know, change one shape that's sort of generic into something that really counts. So again, just to review, and I can do this on the square as well, just to review and talk about this in kind of slow motion, I'm going to hover over where I can actually see it says anchor. I'm going to click with my mouse. I'm going to hold the mouse down, and then I'm going to drag. Okay, so see, I just actually moved it without manipulating the anchor point. That's why this is a tricky tool. Like if you don't get it exactly on there, it'll just move the whole thing. So the direct selection tool can kind of work as both tools in a way. So I'm going to hover. It takes a little bit of practice. If you hover over that where it says anchor, click. I'm holding down on my mouse and I'm dragging, and you can see that line bending easily. Okay, pretty straightforward. I want you to practice and try that on your own. Just go in with your anchor point, doesn't matter what the shape is, and bend those shapes around. All right. So again, just to review, that's the direct selection tool. And the tool above that would be the selection tool. Okay. There's a third tool I want to touch on really briefly, and that is actually underneath the pen tool. So if I hold the pen tool down, there's a tool called the anchor point tool. It looks like sort of like a greater than or less than symbol. If I select that, that actually lets me do even more crazy manipulation. And what the anchor point tool does, it'll take a curved object or a blunt corner, and it allows you to, again, the same process where we click, hold down, and drag over that anchor point. But then when we drag, rather than just bending it and keeping it as a geometric shape, it takes the line and turns it into like an organic line. So that corner is gone, and now we've got this bent shape. Again, if you've ever done any kind of 3D design or sculpture, it's a little bit like that, where you're bending your shapes, bending wires, the way I think about it. Okay, so I just took my triangle, or I should say my rectangle, and I just turned it into a blob because I eliminated those sharp edges. It's kind of fun to play around with, just see what you can come up with. Okay, so I've also got handles on the edge of my anchor point. So my anchor point sets the angle of the curb, but these anchor points that I pull out, those are actually malleable as well. So I can hover over, it actually says handle on it, click on that handle, and then swing that around. And then actually we have gone back to having a sharp point. We click, swing that handle around. And if you just click it, if I just hover over my anchor point and click it down, it pops it back into a sharp edge. All right. So again, you can kind of play around with it and make it into something that is completely different than what you started out with. You can see, you guys are graphic designers, so you can see how this would kind of turn you into, or give you some options with changing things and manipulating things and making interesting logos. Okay. Again, if I just want to clear my screen, which I do, click, hold, or click my, I've gone back to my selection tool, select over the objects, and then just delete them. Easy, pretty easy thing to do there. So that's the three tools that you really need to talk about, or we need to know about. So we're going to talk about text and how that applies to what we've been discussing. So we're kind of moving down the toolbox list here. We've talked about the shape tools, the brush tool, text tool is next. So if you select the type tool, and just like we did before, select within the screen, and you can adjust your size up here in the menu bar at the top of the screen. Adjust the point size. Let's go back and add some text. You can use the selection tool to enlarge that text, do all that sort of thing. Now I'm going to show you how it gets a little bit more crazy, and you have a lot more flexibility now using text in Illustrator than you would in Photoshop or really any other design tool program. And this is a really neat process right here that I really enjoy doing. So right now, I could not go in, zoom in, and mess with the anchor points. I can see them, right? If I hover over, I see it says anchor. I can see my paths, but it's not going to allow me to. So it does let me switch out the fill and the stroke, and I can change the colors on that. So that's not a problem. But I can't actually go in and manipulate those anchor points the same way that I would one of the shapes that we've been working with, either the brush stroke or the star or whatever. It doesn't matter. And I want to do that, okay? So there's a neat little trick for that. You can go up to your menu bar at the very top of the screen here. I'm going to select Object. I'm going to scroll down to Expand. Once again, you select Object, hold down, scroll down to Expand. This window is going to ask me if I want to do the object and the fill. I do. So I click that. And now I can select my direct selection tool, and look what happens now. All of those little anchor points are visible. And just like I was talking about earlier, notice how the anchor points are at the high mark of a curve or at the angle of a piece of text. I could actually now, if you try to just grab the anchor point, sometimes it wants to grab the whole thing. If that happens to you, click off, just click into the negative space, go back, hover back over that edge, click anchor, and then drag it out that way. And look at this. This is kind of fun and weird. I can go in with my text and it treat my letters the same way that I did my objects that we were drawing before. So it's fun, but you're kind of probably thinking, well, what point is this actually? Well, we're doing an exaggerated thing here, but you can imagine if you're a designer and you want your text on your logo to stand out a little bit and be a little bit different, you could go in and tweak those letters to make them unique. You don't necessarily have to completely distort it in the same way that I'm doing right here. So what if you just want your text, the T on your text, to pull out a little bit, something like that, a little bit more subtle. Okay. Now notice, by the way, I can take that T and I can just pull it out. Because we have done what's called expanding the text, it's made all the letters their own individual objects. So it's no longer in text mode. So I can't go in and change. I can't retype it, like you normally could. Select if I have a spelling error or something like that. I can't do that anymore. So you want to make sure if you're doing something like this, the text is the way you want it, because there's no going back on that essentially. Okay, but you can kind of do some fun things. I mean, one of the projects I've given in the past is as a sort of a learning exercise, is I've had students take a particular font and turn it into a Tim Burton font, because you can kind of think about how the director has his particular fonts that he uses for his movie posters, like Beetlejuice and things like that. So I try to give a practical application to what you're doing when you're playing around with the anchor points here and manipulating them. In fact, we're going to do a project where you are going to design a poster to promote a particular font or a typeface of your choosing, and you will be allowed to go in and manipulate the objects in the same way I'm doing here, and kind of distort the font or dissect it if you want to do that. Okay, so again, everything's its own object. I can click, I can delete, and all that sort of stuff, and keep that in mind. Little text 101, just to review, that is under the type tool, and we went up to object and we did what's called expand. Okay, while we're on text, let me talk about one final thing for this lecture. And that is going to be, I noticed while I selected the type tool here that underneath there's a couple different options for you. One is the vertical type tool. I don't use that one very much. That just allows you to type on a vertical plane. But the type on a path tool is an interesting and kind of creative tool that you can use, especially if we get to our typeface poster. Okay, it's also going to give us an excuse to talk about paths a little bit. So what I can do, I can select, let's go to the pencil tool. And as we talked about before, if I just draw a line here with my pencil tool, if I draw a line, just so we can see it, okay, pencil tool works the same as the brush tool, by the way. So my stroke is red. The stroke is red, and that is what we call the path. That's the line in Illustrator. Not the anchor points, but the path. Every line is made up of anchor points and paths. And we have an empty fill, as we know, right? After you draw a line, you can actually hit that boomerang. You can actually see what a line looks like if you have a fill with no stroke on it. Okay, gives you an idea. So this is actually a really important point here. If I want to draw a path without a stroke or a fill, what do I actually have? Okay, so now I've put an empty mark on stroke and fill, and I'm going to draw a little line here. What do I have? Well, I have a path, but I don't have anything that would print or be an image. This blue line with the little anchor points is the path. But if I was to save this as a PDF or print it out, that's not going to be there. What I've actually essentially drawn is an invisible line that I can then take and turn into something else. And okay, you're thinking, well, what does that actually mean? Turn it into what? Well, the path is there as a guide. So I can go back to my text tool here, type on a path tool, remember that. I'm going to select that. I'm going to hover my type on a path tool over the path, and then look what happens. It gives me some generic Latin that we can then change. Okay. And when I type, look at that. Isn't that cool? It disappears if I go over the edge, so I can't type too much, apparently. But I can fix that. Let's go. Just change it to university. Now I've got my text, and it automatically typed along the path, and it gives me something. So again, with your text font design poster, that's going to give you a cool option that you can work with for that. Okay, and again, the way I did that was I just drew I went with my pencil tool, an empty path and an empty fill. I drew that and selected my text along the line, and it automatically will go over that line, which is a cool and helpful thing. Okay. One of the things I've done in the past for my own personal logos is I have selected the shape tools, which I have the rectangle, ellipse, polygon, all that stuff we've already talked about. I'm going to take my ellipse tool. I'm going to click and I'm going to hold down. Now if I hold, here's a good tip to know. If I hold shift down, it takes the ellipse and pops it into a perfect circle. Okay? So if you ever want a perfect circle or perfect square, hold shift down as you're dragging out and lift that up. Okay? So I've got my circle. It automatically did a fill with no stroke. I'm going to select the fill. So now I just did the same thing that I did with my pencil tool. What that means is I eliminated the stroke and the fill. So all that I have left is this invisible path that's making the circle up. You're probably figuring out where I'm going with this. I can select the type on a path tool. I can hover over that, and voila. Now, you've all seen logos that use this technique, right? So you've got a central image in the middle of your logo. And what you can do is actually have the letters wrap around the edge to give it like an interesting and unique effect. Pretty cool. And you can actually reselect those once the letters are on the path. You can reselect it, go in, and make sure that that fits a little better. I can rotate that. So if I want the art department text to be on top, it gives me a little navigator. Okay. Then the graphic design wraps around the bottom. Okay, now I've got my text moving around in a circle, and just for the sake of making a quick logo, let's select the star tool. I can select my little star, sort of making the Converse logo here accidentally. Holding Shift down, keep the proportion in place as I drag out to make it centered. Can go around the edge, get that little boomerang look, and that'll let me rotate the star so I can get it exactly the way I want it. I can switch it to a stroke but no fill. I can manipulate the point if I want that to be changed a little bit. Okay, so a real fast and easy logo that looks sort of effective and interesting here. Give you an idea of how you can use a practical application for the text on a path tool, and of course that's going to work for the star or anything else that you're working with. We've got a nice little logo there. Okay, so that's a good place to stop for just giving you some ideas for how to begin to play around with shape and text in Illustrator. For your out-of-class assignment, I'd like you to just play around with that. I'd like you to do some doodling, come up with a quick logo. See if you can master typing along a path, manipulating the anchor points, and also changing the going in with your anchor point tool to change sharp angles to flowing and more organic lines, and just all the stuff that we talked about, sort of get a handle on it and just have a little bit of playtime before we get into our assignment. Okay, thanks. That's all for today.